It's a great honor to welcome Johan Norberg to the podcast. He is an author, an economist, and the senior fellow at the Cato Institute. We're here to discuss the great Scottish Enlightenment figure, Adam Smith. Johan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
I'm doing very well. It's a good morning here in Budapest, Hungary, and I would assume that you're in Sweden.
That's right. Despite the light and the sun, this is sweet. Yeah.
Right. So before we begin, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about your new book, The Capitalist Manifesto: Why the Global Market Will Save the World. Um, so I think it's a few years after the Karl Marx Friedrich Engels manifesto. So I don't know if it's too late for a response to that, but you're welcome to comment on it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's actually very quite fitting because in a way, my book is an attempt to not make any claim to originality. This is really the kind of lessons that Adam Smith taught us 250 years ago, but they have to be constantly renewed because the debate keeps changing. There are new events and there are new arguments against free markets that have to be dealt with. And I do it in the framework of Adam Smith and the classical economists, but adapted to current controversies and current topics. And my point is that the claims, the arguments that we now need more government intervention, repatriation of supply chains, less free trade, and so on, that's nothing new. It's the same kind of arguments that Adam Smith faced, and they haven't become more relevant and accurate since then, but they have to be dealt with in this new context, and that's what I'm trying to do in the Capitalist Manifesto.
Yes, I would recommend everyone check it out. So Friedrich Hayek, in his work The Road to Serfdom, he dedicates the work to the socialists of all parties. And it was written in, of course, 1944 or 46, if I get that correctly. But that context, that dedication of his rings true today because um, I'm very much surprised to find out that the people who are anti-global free trade are on the right now. I remember seeing footage of protesters who are from the left protesting against the WTO, say in Seattle or something like that. But now is the right who are
Yeah.
railing against the World Economic Forum or again global free trade, and it rings true in America as well as the country where I am now, Hungary. So I wonder if you're surprised by this at all, or did you expect it beforehand?
I am surprised at the speed with which this happened and how deep this change is. 20 years ago, I wrote another book on global capitalism. And back then, the arguments I got from the left are the same arguments that are being repeated today by Donald Trump and Viktor Orban. So they are suddenly the new leftists of this debate. On another level, I'm not that surprised because the basic worldview among some of the more national conservatives and the right-wing populists have always been opposed to the basic classical liberal idea of open societies with neutral governments and open exchange across borders. It's just that they're just as tribal often, just as eager to see the world as a zero-sum game as the traditional anti-capitalist leftists are. It's just that they pick another tribe. And I think that what's happened over the past 20 years is that 20 years ago, lots of people around the world thought that, yes, capitalism and multinational companies and free trade might be good for us in rich industrialized economies, but somebody has to lose, right? And they thought that the poor of the world would. And therefore, in order to make for a more just world order, they picked the side of the of developing countries, thinking that they would benefit from less open markets. And now what we've seen over the past 20 years is that they were absolutely wrong, that nothing has contributed as much to poverty reduction and the growth of poor and middle income countries as open markets. But that has created another effect, that the nationalists and some conservatives in rich countries can visibly see that the poor of the world are getting richer. And since they have the same zero-sum mentality, they think that we are losing in rich countries. And therefore they pick that tribe and want to undermine capitalism and openness.
Okay. So one more before we get to Smith. I still remember in 2020, Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, describing your home country as socialist. Now, I think that a country that produces IKEA and bring that to the world cannot be socialist. But nevertheless, I do read that there is a large level of state control of the Swedish economy, but at the same time, there is a strong current of free market thinking, which you yourself are part of. So why don't you give us a little more detail about Swedish economic debates?
Yes, it's complicated because Sweden doesn't always fit the simple boxes of the present day policy discussions. But what's important to know for Bernie Sanders and others is that Sweden got to be one of the richest countries on the planet by having very open markets, a very limited government and free markets up until 1970. Around that time, until then, Sweden had smaller government, lower taxes than other European countries, and lower than the United States even. That's what built Sweden's fortunes. Then we had a period when we experimented with socialist ideas because we thought that we could. We were already so rich, so we didn't have to care much about production. We could just redistribute. And that's what happened in the 1970s and the 1980s. But that wasn't the golden era of Sweden's economy. On the contrary, this was the moment when Tetra Pak, that had been created before, left Sweden and moved away to, and so did not just IKEA, but Tetra Pak, other entrepreneurs left Sweden because it was difficult to do business. We didn't create a single net job in the private sector for 30 years. So this was a failed experiment. And after a 1990s crisis, Sweden began to liberalize its economy again, and in many respects is now more open, more capitalist than most other countries on the planet. I think we're number 17 of economically free countries in the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index. So that's what explains why the economy is functioning fairly well. It functions according to basically capitalist principles. However, we do have a bigger welfare state than many other countries. It's definitely bigger than the US and the Anglo-Saxon countries. But this is made possible for two reasons. First of all, because of the fierce competitiveness and openness of the economy, so it produces lots of results that can be redistributed. But also, it's not that much of redistribution involved. It's not lots of Americans. Bernie Sanders dream of a welfare state where we take from the rich and give to everybody else. That's not how the Swedish welfare state works. It's more of a redistribution over the life cycle of every Swede. So we get a lot of government services and social security, but we pay for that ourselves over our lifetime. Taxes in Sweden are much less progressive than they are in the United States, in Britain, in Canada, and most other European countries as well. So we learned in the 1970s and 80s that you can't have a big welfare state and just get the rich and businesses to pay for it all. In that case, they will stop producing that wealth. Instead, we tax, and this is the dirty little secret of the Swedish welfare state, we tax poor and middle-income households more than any other country does. Because they are loyal taxpayers. They don't stop working. They don't move to Monaco. They don't have tax attorneys that help them to dodge taxes. So if you want to be like Sweden, you have to, actually take less from the rich. Our corporate taxes are lower than in other rich countries around the world, and make sure that the poor and middle-income households pay for those services.
Okay. Now, on to Smith. I've always regarded him as one of the greats in Scottish Enlightenment, as I've alluded to in the beginning of our conversation. I think of him less as, I guess an economist and more of a philosopher because his official title is Professor of Moral Philosophy, and his first work before beginning an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, which we all know today, is another book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So I wonder, how do you connect these two great works of his?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's the Adam Smith question. What was he really on about? And are the two projects compatible? And to me, they are. They are one of the same project. He was first and foremost a philosopher who tried to understand how humans evolve and interact with one another. How do we build language, norms, ethics, systems of production? Where does all this come from? And he's really a man of the Enlightenment, of the early Enlightenment tradition, a more secularized worldview where not everything is already handed down by God, but we have to explain it in a natural way by looking at human history and by looking at human behavior. And he starts doing this in the theory of moral sentiments, where he's looking at things like how we behave towards one another, what we think of one another, our concepts of empathy and of fairness and other things. And what he discovers is that, and this is really groundbreaking, I would say, in the history of ideas, that this evolves naturally. That's his theory. It doesn't come down handed to us from governments or God or priests. It appears in the exchange with other people, exchange of thoughts, ideas, language, behavior. And when we are in a social setting, we constantly meet the expectations and the disappointments or approval of by others, and we want that. We are by nature social animals, according to Adam Smith. And over our whole life, we then develop certain attitudes and norms that are the conscious but often unconscious result of all of these interactions with others. And one concept that he has is that we have developed something like a conscience, and his conscience, Adam Smith's conscience, he calls it the impartial spectator. When we think of what to do in a certain situation, is this the right thing to do? Is it the good thing to do? It is as if there was an impartial spectator looking at us from the outside who doesn't have our interests or anything like that, but just judges our behavior according to that. And sometimes this is entirely subconscious, but it is a conscience nonetheless that develops. And Adam Smith thinks that most of our behavior is governed according to such norms, which are often not formalized, not verbalized, but they exist in our mind and in our breasts. And the thing with the next book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, is that it is basically the same project, trying to uncover and discover the order that's already there beneath the surface in a way, but now not just the norms, our behavior according to moral ideas about fairness, but now related to the economy and according to politics. But it's the same kind of project, understanding that order is not created from above. It's not handed down from somebody. It appears in exchanges. But now in The Wealth of Nations, he's more interested in how does that appear when it comes to our means of working, producing, innovating, and creating all the wealth that is out there around us. And he's discovering that in the newly commercialized society of 18th century Britain and Scotland, where he's looking at the Sunday markets, it appears not designed by anyone, but it appears in constant exchange, truck barter in exchange with other people, and hearing about their attitude, their preferences, the prices that they suggest. and our constant negotiation with them makes us try to find the best places where we can come up with good services and innovations that are in their best interest, and thereby producing more growth, more wealth in the future.
I see. There's one reason why I would refrain from using the word capitalism when I refer to the economic system that, has its roots in Adam Smith. I would prefer to call it the free market or the liberal free market, because nowadays the word has been deprived of its meaning. When I say capitalism, most people think of the big wealthy companies controlling every facet of our lives and depriving the poor of wealth and freedom. But when it comes to the free market, it has it evokes agency. Like each of us are participants in the market, and we have some say in how much wealth we accrue or what kind of decision we make with our wealth. And I'm sure that with the image of the marketplace, Smith was evoking that. And of course, in the Wealth of Nations, the word capitalism is not even used. So I guess now my question is, to what extent can the moral sentiments that he had developed in the theory of moral sentiments be applied in the economic sphere?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, he doesn't use the word capitalism, and it hasn't been developed or coined by then. He talks about the liberal plan of liberty and justice that allows every man to pursue his own interest his own way. And that's really, you're right. This is the free market, a market that is free from outside control and dictates. However, when I use the word capitalism, I do it because it's still the word that is being thrown about in popular debate and by our opponents. So if we don't fill it with any kind of meaning, they will. But I'm very cautious trying to define it in a different way. It's not ruled by capital. That capitalism is about. It's about the decentralized rule by millions and millions of different actors in the economy every day. And I think that's what Smith talks about in The Wealth of Nations, how he uses what he's seen in the theory of moral sentiments. Many of the concepts and ideas are already coined and developed in the theory of moral sentiments, and then he applies them in The Wealth of Nations to the economy. And one of them is the invisible hand, the idea that we seem to end up spontaneously, non-coerced, in various places where we try to do other people different services, helping to create a better society for others. And this could be when we, in civil society, in family life, trying to do good for others, not because we've been told to or forced to do this, but because we want to live in this kind of thriving society as well. We want, if we are to be loved, we have to be lovable. And then he applies this invisible hand to the economic sphere as well, pointing out that people, if we stop controlling them, stop trying to tell them where to go, what to do, they will often find a place in the economy where they do as much good as possible for other people, creating new knowledge, technological capacity, goods and services that are of use to everybody else, not because they've been forced to go there, but because of the norms and the rules of the free market, whereby you can only get rich by enriching others. If there is this system of rules, of property rights, of dictating that exchange has to be voluntary, then we will find out that the only way to get, for example, a wage, an income, a profit from others is to give them something that they value more than the money that they hand over to us. And therefore, we have to work desperately hard to try to come up with things that will improve their lives. And therefore, it will seem as if we are governed by an invisible hand to go to places where we do other people's services. And that's why Adam Smith points out that it's not by relying on the benevolence of the baker or the butcher that we expect our daily bread and meat, but by their own concern for their self-interest. They will then make sure that we will get as much and decent and cheap bread and meat as possible.
Right. And another reason why I hesitate to use the word capitalism as a descriptive term is that recently there's been a new movement for what you call stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism, where I think the greatest example of it is ESG, environmental, social, and governance index,
Yeah.
where I think it's only been a feature of big business at this point, but apparently most big businesses now think that their responsibility exceeds far beyond, well, making good product and accruing a profit and pleasing the shareholders, is to promote a form of social welfare. And for Smith, that dates back to the system of mercantilism that he worked so hard to repudiate, especially in The Wealth of Nations. He says that mercantilism works with the intent of benefiting the public good, but end up depriving its people of wealth. So, yeah, tell us more about how mercantilism works and why Smith was against it.
Yeah, mercantilism is really the system of economics that was in effect when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. And it's really what he launches his violent attack against all through this book. It's a system which is very much built on the idea that the economy is a zero-sum game, that if someone is to gain something, there will have to be pain for others. And therefore, it's dangerous to have a free, open market where because people have to be constantly controlled, kept in check. They have to be told what to do and where to go. And especially in international relationships, this is an important doctrine because it stops free trade from, and really trade on a large scale from appearing, because mercantilists usually think that it's a good thing if we manage to export goods to others, because then we will get valuable resources, gold, silver, coins in exchange. And that's good because it makes us rich. But we don't want to buy things from others because imports, it will make sure that those important metals, they move to our enemies out there in the market. And this is obviously something that lots of people still believe in. This is the doctrine of Donald Trump and sometimes of Joe Biden as well, that people think that it's a good thing to export, but it's a bad thing to import. And it's really the other way around. This is turning things on its head, as Adam Smith points out in The Wealth of Nations, because exporting, that's the price that we pay for what we want. The imports is actually when we're getting something. That's our income. That's our wage. That's why we're working hard to get something, to lay our hands on the resources that we couldn't produce as well by ourselves. The exports, that's the work that we have to do and go through in order to buy the imports that we want. So really, imports, that's payday, and exports, that's workday. So as Smith points out, it's better if we can export as little as possible for the imports that we're getting. That would be a better trade-off. But his more important basic point is that trade then is a mutually beneficial exchange. No deal would ever happen unless both parties thought that they would benefit from it. And thereby also, it's not just that we're getting things that we want, it's also that it encourages specialization at home. We can then focus on the areas of the economy where we are as efficient as possible and thereby buy as much imports as possible from sectors where we aren't as efficient.
I do notice nowadays, at least in American politics, words like mercantilism and protectionism are left out the political economic vocabulary. Instead, they use something like economic nationalism, economic populism, and import substitution. But essentially, those words mean the same thing. Um,
Yeah.
what I do struggle to understand is why, despite the abundance of evidence to show that they do not help the economy, they do not help the people they're trying to help, et cetera, in all across the countries, including, I suppose, America historically, why are these policies keep becoming popular?
Yeah, that is the question. Why do we have to keep on writing books on the same topic again and again when Adam Smith already showed this 250 years ago, that it's a completely useless system? I think that it goes to show that these ideas aren't intuitive. Understanding how value is created and understanding that exchange can be mutually beneficial doesn't come naturally to human beings. It's something that you have to learn intellectually and understand intellectually by studying economics, studying history, and doing lots of detailed policy analysis of recent tariffs like American tariffs that were introduced to protect jobs in steel, for example, which, yes, might have might have saved some more efficient jobs from going, but at the cost of all the jobs in downstreams industries that are using steel, which makes it more expensive to all those industries, American industries, to produce jobs. So it's not just costly to the consumers, it also ruins industries. But you have to study that. It's not natural to us. And to me, I think this is because of human nature. I think we should be happy that we live in an era after Adam Smith wrote his books and those ideas were influential, because that has created modern economic growth, the amazing improvement in our living standards by a factor of perhaps 30, where extreme poverty has declined from more than 80% of the world's population to less than 8% of the world's population today. That's wonderful to be. We should be grateful to be living in that era of human history. However, that's not where our instincts come from. And it's not where many of our um, rules of thumb and systems of ideology and ideas come from. They come from a previous era of hundreds of thousands of years when we lived in an economy that didn't really change in a dramatic way. We didn't see much innovation and economic growth during people's lifetimes. So it wasn't natural to think about the economy as a positive sum game where we create more value constantly, where exchange is mutually beneficial, at least not on a macro scale. So it's easy for demagogic politicians to scare us back into our sort of reptilian brains, thinking that, oh, it's a threat out there. The economy is dangerous. We have to protect you against all those dangerous foreigners and capitalists who are always looking to exploit you. And we have to respond by saying, yeah, but read these very thick books and you will understand why this is not a good way of creating wealth and protecting yourself. And that's often an uphill battle. And that's why we have to keep on repeating ourselves and rewriting the same kind of books.
Okay. Now, The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, which a year that means a lot to Americans because that's a year of American independence. So I wonder, do you regard it as just a mere coincidence, or is there something more significant in that time?
That's a great question. I don't think it's a coincidence, because ideas like this have been brewing for quite some time. I'd say for 100 years at least. This have been especially in the Dutch Republic and in Scotland and in England, these ideas had emerged, but also in countries like France with the physiocratic economic schools. Even in Sweden, 11 years before Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, we had a Enlightenment who gave us in politics, in parliament, a very early freedom of the press statute, but also wrote a book 11 years before Wealth of Nations, but a much shorter book, explaining how with the price system and the freedom to move about the economy with free markets, we will end up in places where we create more value and innovation to other people, and therefore we should deregulate the economy. So ideas like this had been brewing for a long time, and they had become more fashionable. And in some areas, they had begun to produce results. Especially the Dutch Republic had gone to becoming the richest economy in the history of the human race by having very open markets and free trade. So both Adam Smith and those kinds of theories and the rebellious streak among Americans and the founding fathers, they come from the same kind of intellectual environment. Then Adam Smith systematizes these ideas and they become hugely popular, and all the founding fathers read Adam Smith. James Madison loved it, Thomas Jefferson loved it. And actually, many of the debates among the founding fathers were about how should we interpret Adam Smith. So you had on the one side Madison and Jefferson saying that this means that we need free trade and a very limited government, whereas Alexander Hamilton on the other side said that no, we need this kind of industrialization that Smith is beginning to write about and beginning to see. And for that, we might need some stronger federal government that has for example, a stable monetary system and a way of funding the government via debt and such things, and even some tariffs. He thought that that was an interpretation of Adam Smith that could be functional. So it's obvious that Adam Smith is formed by this intellectual environment, and he's forming that intellectual environment further.
Now, one thing I regard as a tremendous power of Enlightenment ideas, the free market included, is how cross-cultural it can be. Of course, both of us are familiar with Max Weber's work on the Protestant ethic. Now, yeah, of course, these days, the spirit of capitalism, the second part of Weber's analysis, is not just limited to Protestant countries. You see countries with Confucian ethics like China and my home country of Vietnam applying that spirit in the extent that they do, and countries with Hindu ethics like India does that too. And of course, free market thinkers spring up everywhere alongside Smith. You have Bertrand de Jouvenel in France, Milton Friedman in America, and of course the Austrians, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek. I wonder, in your view, why do free market ideas gain such a cross-cultural appeal?
I think this is an incredibly important point that you're raising, because it's always easy to look at the most successful economy for the moment and then try to trace all of that success to the particular intellectual, religious environment that they are in for the moment. And that's Max Weber was an incredibly smart and deep thinker. But I think he confused the fact that, look, the Dutch are great at capitalism. And look, they're also Calvinists. So there must be something with how Calvinism and this kind of religious movement had affected them. But had he looked a bit deeper, he would have seen that the early free market in the Dutch Republic was being created in as early as the 13th century and the 14th century. That was when they began to have property rights in farmland and the land that they took back from the ocean, and they began to trade with the rest of the world first with the rest of Europe, and began to develop the capitalist spirit a long time before they became Calvinists. So when people then said that, look, it seems to be working where they are Protestants, like the Dutch and the British, well, but where did they get some of these capitalist institutions? Well, they got it from Renaissance Italy, from Venice and from Florence, Catholic countries, all of them. And where did they get them from? Well, often they were inspired by the Arab cultures. And then afterwards, of course, we saw, as you mentioned, we saw it in Asia, we saw it in Japan, in Korea, Taiwan. We see that wherever the Chinese get some kind of economic freedom, they have a very entrepreneurial spirit. Now we're seeing it in India as well. To me, this suggests that culture is not fate. It doesn't determine where you're going. It influences where you're going, but you influence that culture as well as you go along. And you began to emphasize different aspects of your culture and of your religion, depending on where you go and how you act and behave. And I think that's a very Adam Smithian insight as well. The constant exchange with other people from discussion to behavior to economics influences your whole value system as well, and what you emphasize. And I think when I study human history, I can see that basically all ideas and all religions have been interpreted in very closed-minded authoritarian ways, but also they have been interpreted in other eras and by other people in a very open and a very liberal, very free market oriented way as well. And that, I think, is what makes free markets so incredibly cross-culturally successful, because they establish a way of exchanging and engaging with other people that establishes a certain individual dignity to other people and even to strangers, which is very unique in the history of ideas. And that then forces us, when we adapt to such behavior and such attitudes, it forces us to look again at our cultural heritage and begin to emphasize the parts of that heritage that facilitates this kind of outlook to the world.
I want us to dive into the two main intellectual opponents of Smith, starting with Marx. Now, I think Marx is an heir to the classical economic tradition of Smith, and but him being a class-focused thinker believes that Smith's system of liberal free market creates these two classes of people, the bourgeois and the working class. And the bourgeois benefits from the system, but the working class is not. So I wonder whether Smith anticipates this development at all.
I think he does, in a way. This is an interesting question, because I think that many of the power relationships that Marx writes about is something that is already present in Adam Smith. When people say that, look, the whole ideas of free markets and stuff like that, you neglect that there are always hidden power relationships, and that means that every exchange isn't equal. That's completely false. The whole of Wealth of Nations is about such power relationships and of how special interests and quite often the merchants are there trying to rig the rules of the game to get ahead, to get privileges, tariff protection, guild systems, other ways of corruption that makes life miserable to others. And that's really at the heart of it all, Smith's argument for limited government and for a system of rules which creates as much openness in the economy as possible, that if you have detailed regulations that tell people who can do what at what price and with whom, then that system will always be rigged by the guys in charge, those who are politically connected, those who are wealthy and influential. It's not that he trusts businesses and merchants to always be wise and kind, that he's in favor of free markets. If he thought so, well, why not hand them a monopoly? It's because he doesn't trust them that he says they have to be constantly exposed to competition, to free trade, so that people can always challenge them and move elsewhere. I think that some of this power relationships is then borrowed by Karl Marx, but he simplifies it. He makes it much more primitive by just looking at various tribes, rather than understanding that abuse of the system can be performed by any group. He says that, look, here are the workers, they're basically the good guys, and then the evil merchants and capitalists, and we have to continue this historical necessity of just handing power to the workers instead, thereby neglecting the risk that those who speak in favor of the workers will in their turn rig the rules and completely ruin the whole system, not just for the capitalists, but for workers as well. But I think some of that is borrowed by Smith, and especially if there's one big failure in Adam Smith. I think his analysis of the power relationships, that's great. But there's one problem. He doesn't really create an understanding of value, what creates economic value. He thinks that this is in a way inherent. He's a little bit conflicted on this, but it's just created by work, by the time and the effort that you go through to produce something, which means that he doesn't really have a theory to explain why water, which is really more valuable to us, is so much less expensive than gold or diamonds. That's not really of value to us, which is he needs the subjective theory of value, which comes much later with Karl Menger and the Austrian school and other economists who understood that, no, it's what's really important to us is the last piece, I mean, of something, the piece, the good, the service on the margin. Will I be much more happy from one more gallon of water? Probably not, but I will be so I won't pay that much for it. But I would from a diamond or from gold. And this gives Karl Marx a possibility to say, look, yes, it's just the work, the effort that we exert that's important, which means that workers create all the value, and the capitalists and the merchants, they basically they don't perform any important value because they don't sweat, and thereby he can distort some of Smith's and Ricardo's theories about the labor theory of value into a completely abstract system of value that makes it seem like workers are constantly exploited by the capitalists.
Mhm. Okay. So another opponent of Smith, and I would argue this is the more prominent or stronger opponent, is Keynes. Because unlike Marx, Keynes completely repudiates the classical economic model started by Smith. His general theory of jobs, interests, and money was written in the wake of the Great Depression. And here Keynes argues, if I read correctly, that the Smithian economic model does not neither predicts nor prevents economic crises. And if anything, it may lead to more crises as the spontaneity of the liberal free market creates booms and busts. So I wonder, to what extent did Smith anticipate economic crises?
Well, he's writing in the middle of economic crisis. There are lots of he actually delays final publication of The Wealth of Nations for a year or so because there is an ongoing real estate and banking crisis in Scotland, and he wants to write about that in his book as well. And of course, it's true with what we know today about financial crises and the complexity of modern security systems and the involvement of monetary policy and the interest rate to inform and influence our decisions, that, yeah, Adam Smith might seem a little bit primitive, but that's because he's writing in a much more primitive economy. So he hasn't faced the kind of crises that we have been facing in in the 20th century and the 21st century. But I do think that he doesn't neglect it. He looks at it, he writes about it, and he has important things to add. And one of them being, when he writes about the Scottish banks, is that a crisis is often the result of mistaken speculation, of exaggerated hopes for a particular industry. And then the best way of dealing with that crisis is to allow those mistakes to fail and to be sure that those Scottish banks that have lent too much to those speculators, that they don't survive for long. Why is that? Well, because they have ended up in the wrong places in the economy, where they don't create value, they destroy value. And in that case, we have to make sure that they, as fast as possible, capital and labor move towards the sectors of the economy where they can create more value again. And that will be painful in the short run, but it's the only way to get out of the crisis. What Keynes says, in effect, is that it's a primitive way of doing it, because you don't really avoid the horrors of the downturn, of the recession. Instead, we have to move into the recession and just pump up consumption again through various means and allow people to be saved. I think that Smith would have said that, you're not solving the crisis. You're not dealing with the crisis. You are protecting and subsidizing the failures and the mistakes, which will only prolong the problems and delay the time that it takes people and capital to find the right place in the economy again. And you will risk doing it. I'm pretty sure he would have said, and it's always dangerous to guess what a guy who's been dead for more than 2 centuries would have said about present crisis. But I'm pretty sure, according to his framework of ideas, that he would have said that the risk is that you will encourage excessive risk-taking in dangerous places. If people know that they will be protected from their failures, capitalism is a risk and is a profit and loss system. And both the profits and the losses are very important signals to doing the right thing and constantly thinking about the impossible impact of your decisions. And I'm also pretty sure that he would have said that if the government gets involved in this way, if we get central banks who are constantly involved in trying to protect the stock market and even hedge funds from the mistakes that they've been doing, and constant bailouts of financial companies when they made mistakes, this will be rigged by the powerful, by the special interest groups who will, even if it had been a splendid theoretical idea, it will be distorted by the powerful, and so that they can continue to take crazy risks and then send all their losses to the taxpayers.
Mhm. Yes. I also like to provide that being pro-market does not necessarily mean that you're pro-business, because I think is the contrary is the case. If you're pro-business, you might be anti-market. Because well, two things. When we think of big business, or at least the anti-capitalist people think of big business as this all-controlling force that is powered by capitalism. But you and I can think of at least like 5 big business or banks or companies that have failed, that have fallen into obscurity, say Blockbuster or AOL or Lehman Brothers, to name a few. Secondly, there is a tendency for big business to work with big government, as is the case in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, where there's this doctrine of too big to fail and government bailouts and such. Um, so I wonder to, for Smith, how does he think of the relationship between business and government, and how they should be regulated?
Yeah, yeah, he's very, very worried about this. I mean, he's worried about many different groups and their influence on policy making. He's not just merchants, but also priests and politicians and artisans in their guild systems and other ways. So he's a suspicious guy because he knows that there will always be the temptation to take the rules and distort them to get some sort of privilege that makes it possible for them to triumph in the market. And he definitely sees this risk when it comes to people acting in the market, whether they be artisan workers or merchants, that whenever they meet, even for recreation, they will always come up with a plot, a conspiracy to cheat the public interest and to increase their prices and make life miserable. So don't pay too much attention to what businesses tell politicians to do, because it's often a way to get a protective tariff or get an occupational licensing, something to, or a regulation that will be tailor-made to their needs, but makes it very difficult to somebody else to start competing with them. And this is really why we need this simple liberal plan that Adam Smith talks about: equality before the law, equal rights, property rights, and freedom to trade and engage in voluntary transactions. But don't get involved. Don't get the government involved as a player in the market, because even if it comes with good intentions, it will always be taken over by people who have very specific intentions, governed by their own economic self-interest, and that will not be we will not be led by an invisible hand. In that case, we will be led by a very visible interventionist hand from the government that just helps to lift some groups and businesses up at the cost and detriment to others and to the consumers.
Yes. So I'd like to end on this note. Now, I believe that Keynes is a much more potent threat to Smith than Marx, because the temptation of people to want a planned economy is prevalent. I suppose even before Keynes wrote his work. I read that during times of crisis, there's always a call from the populace to the statesman, saying do something. I suppose it runs counter to, say, the Tocquevillian spirit of do it yourself, form a civil society and solve this crisis by your own hands. But and I think it is because, as you've alluded to, the economy is more complicated now than when Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. So the temptation is always there for the populace to basically voluntarily give up their agency and call to the people who govern them. So I wonder, to what extent is Smith's insights still applicable to today's world?
Yeah, I think they're more relevant and applicable to present problems than any time that I've lived through. Because Smith's basic idea is that all the knowledge, all the creativity that makes societies and economies function, they're spread out, they're decentralized in the millions and billions of people. And often we're not even conscious of what we're capable of doing, what we could do instead. It only appears in our action, in our behavior. And this means that it's impossible to centralize it. That's his plan. That's his basic theory. You know, Adam Smith writes about the man of system, which is really the sort of the big government or the populist who treats people like they are pieces on a chessboard and just puts them where he wants them. And Smith points out that that won't create order, that will create chaos, because all of these people, they know better where to move on the chessboard because they have their own unique vantage point onto the world and onto their own skill sets. And this is always a necessary factor to understand the economy. If we want to create growth, thriving economies, innovation, we have to do the Tocquevillian, Smithian thing and allow these pieces on chessboards, us human beings, to go out and look and experiment and try and exchange and through trial and error coming up with better things. That's always, I think, the most important case against centralized economies and government control. But in present circumstances, when people feel scared about a dangerous, unpredictable world, it could be geopolitical rivalries, the pandemic, we've had a global warming, we have global terrorism. We have so many unknown variables right now. I leave it to everyone who's listening to this to consider whether it might have been much worse in the past. It's just that we now have more information than ever before about all these threats, but that's another thing. The important thing is that this basic case that individual local knowledge is necessary is stronger than ever when the world is unpredictable, when we don't know what will happen next. If we knew everything in advance, perhaps we could have a more centrally planned economy. If there were fewer variables, then it's easier for a few people at the top to sort of control things and just steady as she goes in a way. But when the world is unpredictable and we don't know what will happen next, it's more important than ever that all those millions and billions of points of knowledge and creativity, that they are allowed to use that knowledge to come up with new solutions to how to deal with all these problems. That's Adam Smith's basic insight. And the more complex the world becomes or feels, and the more unpredictable the world becomes, the more relevant Adam Smith's basic insight becomes.
So I suppose courage and creativity are virtues, so to speak, needed in the free marketplace.
I think that's how we if we want an economy, if we want a world where we come up with new ways of creating business models, production, new innovations that have never been in the world before. And this is the way to create more human opportunity. If they've never been in the world before, how can we make sure that they appear in the world? Only through creativity, through experiments, through trial and error. It doesn't happen according to a plan. It takes creativity and local knowledge to develop it.
I think that's a very good note to end on. Thank you very much, Johan Norberg, for being on the show.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it tremendously.